Judge Arthur Callahan's gavel slammed down so hard that the sound reverberated through the quiet courtroom. He leaned back in his high chair, casting a scornful look over the top of his glasses at the young woman standing before him. His lips curled into a mocking smile as he took in her plain appearance. She looked every bit the part of someone who had no place in his courtroom, a feeling that amused him. "You think you can stand here and lecture me on the law?" he scoffed, his voice dripping with mockery. "I've been on this bench for over 30 years. 30! And you," he gestured lazily toward her, "you're just some quiet nobody who probably Googled a few legal terms last night, aren't you?" The courtroom, packed with the usual suspects, lawyers and spectators, chuckled. The tension in the room broke, and Judge Callahan seemed satisfied with the reaction. But the young woman didn't flinch. She stood tall in a modest navy blue blazer, her hands clasped in front of her, unwavering. "Are you done, Judge?" Her calm voice cut through the laughter, sharp and unflinching. For a split second, the judge's smirk faltered. The courtroom grew silent, and a strange tension filled the air. The young woman, whose name was Olivia Carter, stepped forward confidently, her heels clicking on the hard marble floor. She placed a thick, worn legal book onto the table before her with a deliberate thud. "If you are, I'd like to remind you of a ruling made in this very courtroom," Olivia continued, her voice unwavering. "A ruling made by you, in fact, where you argued the exact opposite of what you're claiming now." Judge Callahan's face drained of color as the courtroom gasped. He faltered, his earlier bravado now gone. Who was this woman? The morning had been uneventful, far too quiet for the veteran judge's tastes. It was supposed to be another routine hearing, a simple eviction case. The landlord, a middle-aged man named Henry Brooks, was attempting to evict his tenant, a quiet woman named Olivia, who had barely spoken a word since entering the courtroom. Her meek appearance was in stark contrast to Brooks, who had arrived with a polished, expensive lawyer by his side, Jonathan Pierce, a sharp-dressed attorney with a smile that seemed to think it could solve all problems. Olivia had introduced herself as simply Olivia Carter, in a soft voice that barely carried through the room. She had no lawyer, no legal representation, and yet, as she stood there, the entire courtroom had begun to feel the weight of her presence. Judge Callahan had seen this type of case countless times. Quiet, ordinary people up against well-connected, smug landlords. It was always a one-sided affair. He was prepared to rush through it as quickly as possible. He wasn't concerned about the tenant's plight. People like Olivia rarely stood a chance. But Olivia's first words had struck him like a cold slap in the face. She didn't stammer or beg for mercy. Instead, she calmly pointed out that the eviction notice served to her was illegal under state law. "Your Honor, I'd like to point out that the eviction notice served to me is invalid under Section 83.5-6 of our state tenant laws," Olivia said, her voice measured. "A valid eviction requires a minimum of 7 days' notice for alleged lease violations. I was given only 3. Judge Callahan had raised an eyebrow. "Excuse me?" The room shifted uncomfortably as the murmurs began. Even Henry Brooks's lawyer, Jonathan Pierce, seemed taken aback, unsure of how to respond. The judge had expected the usual mix of excuses or emotional pleas, but Olivia stood there, entirely composed, waiting. She continued, "The notice was improperly served, and therefore, under state law, it should be dismissed." She handed over a copy of her lease agreement to Judge Callahan, who grabbed it with a sigh. Pierce had scoffed. "There's no need for this. We all know this is a formality." She violated her lease. Olivia held up her hand, cutting him off politely. "With all due respect, I'm not finished yet." The judge sighed audibly. Let me guess. You're going to tell me this is all some kind of clerical error, right? His words were laced with sarcasm, and he was clearly eager to dismiss Olivia's challenge. Olivia's voice didn't waver. No, Your Honor. I'm simply here to present the truth. She pulled out a legal document from her bag, placing it on the table before the judge. His smug demeanor started to crack as he skimmed through the lease she had handed over. It didn't contain any of the supposed violations Pierce had claimed. The landlord's case was falling apart, and for the first time, the judge was genuinely concerned. "What is this?" Judge Callahan muttered, his voice no longer confident. Pierce looked over the document, and his face fell. This can't be right. There's no record of this in our files," he said, scrambling for an explanation. Olivia remained silent, her steady gaze fixed on the judge. She was unfazed by the growing tension in the room. She didn't need to gloat or raise her voice. Her calm assurance spoke volumes. "Your Honor," Olivia spoke again, "I'd also like to remind you of a case you ruled on last year, Brooks v. Miller. In that case, you specifically ruled that eviction notices served improperly were grounds for dismissal. I believe the same principle applies here." Judge Callahan's face turned pale. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. This wasn't supposed to happen. His smug smile had vanished, replaced by something resembling panic. The courtroom, once filled with chuckles and murmurs, was now silent. The power had shifted. Olivia stood there, confident and poised, her eyes never leaving the judge's. She was doing more than defending herself. She was exposing the flaws in the system, and that made her a threat, one that Judge Callahan hadn't anticipated. You've studied the law?" Judge Callahan finally managed to ask, his voice strained. Olivia didn't flinch. "I study it every day, Your Honor," she replied simply. The judge looked stunned, not knowing how to respond. The room was still silent, and for the first time in decades, Judge Callahan found himself questioning his authority. This was no longer just a routine case, it was a challenge. Judge Callahan paused for a moment, his eyes narrowing as he tried to process what Olivia had just said. For a second, there was silence in the room, save for the soft murmur of the court stenographer's keys clicking away. The judge, who had spent decades on the bench, wasn't used to being challenged. Not like this. He leaned back in his chair, adjusting his glasses as he tried to regain some semblance of control. "So," he began slowly, his voice colder now, "you're telling me that I made an error in my ruling last year, and that you're using that to claim victory today?" Olivia didn't flinch. She stood tall, her hands still resting calmly on the table. Her demeanor was calm and collected, as though the weight of the entire courtroom was irrelevant to her. "Not an error, Your Honor," she corrected, her voice firm. "A ruling you made, and one that still stands in law. The same principle applies to this case." The courtroom fell into a stunned silence. No one spoke. Even the defense lawyer, Jonathan Pierce, stood frozen, his mouth slightly agape, unsure of how to respond. The power had clearly shifted in Olivia's favor, and she wasn't backing down. Judge Callahan ran a hand over his face, his expression now one of frustration. This wasn't the way he envisioned the day unfolding. It was supposed to be a simple eviction case. The landlord, Henry Brooks, had money and power on his side. The tenant, Olivia, was a nobody. No lawyer, no legal backing, just a quiet woman with no connections. It should have been easy. But now, everything had changed. Olivia had turned the tables, and he knew it. He could feel the weight of the room's expectation on him. The once smug expression on his face was gone, replaced by a look of quiet disbelief. "You've certainly done your homework, Miss Carter," Judge Callahan muttered, almost to himself, as he scanned the pages in front of him. "But that doesn't change the fact that you're still facing eviction. No matter how much legal theory you throw at me, facts are facts." Olivia didn't waver. "Your Honor, I'm not just quoting theory," she said, her voice never rising in volume. "I've presented evidence that this eviction is illegal under state law, and the facts are on my side. The notice wasn't served correctly, and the case should be dismissed." The judge sighed heavily, still unwilling to fully concede. "That's your argument, but you still haven't answered the central issue here. Did you violate your lease agreement, Miss Carter? That's what this is really about." Olivia opened her leather briefcase and carefully pulled out a thick file of documents. She slid the file across the table toward the judge. "Here's the proof, Your Honor," she said. "The lease agreement contains no violation, and I've provided records showing that the landlord's claims are false." The room was utterly still as Judge Callahan picked up the file and flipped through the pages. Pierce, looking more and more anxious, peered over the judge's shoulder, trying to make sense of what was unfolding. A few moments passed before Judge Callahan finally spoke. "Well," he muttered under his breath, "this certainly complicates things." He paused again, studying Olivia with a new level of scrutiny. The tension in the courtroom was palpable. The usual certainty that came with Judge Callahan's presence seemed to evaporate with every word that came from Olivia's mouth. Olivia continued to stand silently, her gaze unwavering. "I've studied the law, Your Honor, not in a classroom or under the guidance of a professor, but on my own. I've helped dozens of tenants just like myself. People who've been bullied by landlords who think they can bend the law to their will." The courtroom was silent once more. Olivia's words had struck a chord. It wasn't just the technicality of the case that mattered to her. It was the principle behind it. Her fight wasn't only for her own home, but for all those who had been silenced, their voices lost in the system. She wasn't just a tenant in an eviction case. She was a symbol of those who couldn't speak for themselves. Judge Callahan studied her, a mix of skepticism and curiosity in his eyes. "You've clearly done your research, Miss Carter. I'll give you that," he admitted reluctantly. "But you still don't have the kind of legal experience that should be required to challenge me in my courtroom. What makes you think you're qualified to stand here and argue the law with professionals?" Olivia didn't hesitate. "Because, Your Honor," she said calmly, "the law isn't just for the professionals. It's for everyone, and I make it my job to understand it, to use it to fight for justice." The judge shifted uncomfortably in his seat. This wasn't what he expected. He'd assumed this would be a quick, easy case. Just another routine eviction that would take no more than a few minutes to clear. But now, he found himself face to face with a woman who seemed to know more about the law than he did, despite not having the same qualifications. He ran his hand through his graying hair, sighing deeply. The room was thick with tension, the weight of Olivia's words hanging in the air. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he leaned forward, his expression softened. "All right, Miss Carter," he said reluctantly. "I'll concede that you've presented a compelling argument. But this case is about more than just the law. It's about the facts." Olivia remained calm. "And the facts are, Your Honor, that my eviction notice is invalid, and I am entitled to more time before any eviction proceedings can begin. The law is clear." Judge Callahan sat back in his chair, a long pause hanging in the air. The courtroom was still. For the first time in his career, he felt uncertain. Olivia Carter had just handed him a reality check, and, as much as it pained him to admit it, she was right. "I see," the judge muttered finally. "I'll take a recess to review the evidence further. This case isn't as clear-cut as I first thought." The tension in the room slowly began to dissipate as the judge stood and motioned for a short break. Olivia remained at the table, her composure never wavering. She wasn't celebrating yet. There was still much to be done, but she had proven her point. And for the first time, Judge Callahan was questioning his own judgment. As the room emptied for the recess, Olivia took a deep breath, her mind racing. This fight was far from over, but she had won the first round. She had earned the judge's attention, and that was more than most people ever got in a courtroom like this. She just had to keep pushing. The short recess was a welcome relief for everyone in the courtroom. The air had grown thick with tension, and the room felt heavy with the weight of the unseen power shift. But Olivia Carter didn't move from her spot at the table. She kept her hands folded in front of her, her calm demeanor never wavering. She had fought her first battle, but she knew it was only the beginning. As the other lawyers and spectators filed out of the room, the low murmur of their conversations buzzed around her. She paid them no mind. Her thoughts were elsewhere, focused on the case before her. She could hear Judge Callahan's voice, a muffled conversation with his clerk in the hallway. He was likely gathering his thoughts, processing the unexpected turn of events. Olivia knew this wasn't just about her anymore. This was about something much larger than one eviction case. It was about the system, the corruption that had crept into every corner of it, and the people who had suffered because of it. But Olivia had not come here to be a passive observer. She had come to expose the rot from within. She wasn't just defending herself against an unfair eviction. She was standing up for every person who had been taken advantage of by landlords like Henry Brooks. People who didn't have the knowledge, the resources, or the voices to fight back. People who were left in the dark, afraid to speak out because they didn't understand the law and because they had nowhere to turn. Olivia had been there once, one of those people who had no clue where to start when faced with the cold, impersonal machinery of the law. But she wasn't there anymore. Over the years, she had taught herself the ins and outs of legal research. It hadn't been easy. She didn't have a mentor to guide her, no law school to attend. Instead, she had relied on books, thick, intimidating volumes of case law and statutes. She had spent long nights reading, cross-referencing, and studying until one day it all clicked. The law wasn't just a set of rules, it was a powerful tool, one that could be used to fight injustice. And she had the determination to master it. The decision to study law on her own hadn't been an easy one. Olivia had grown up in a small apartment in a rundown part of town, raised by a mother who struggled to make ends meet. Her father had left when she was a child, leaving her mother to raise her alone. Olivia's childhood had been a quiet one, marked by the constant stress of bills, eviction notices, and the feeling that no one ever really cared about people like them. She had always been a quiet child, observant and introspective, and from a young age she had noticed how the law seemed to favor the powerful. The landlords, the corporations, the politicians, they were the ones who had access to legal help, to the expertise that made navigating the system possible. People like her mother, who worked long hours just to pay the rent, didn't have that kind of access. They were left to fend for themselves, trapped by the very system that was supposed to protect them. It had been when Olivia herself had received her first eviction notice that the fire for justice had been ignited. She had been 23 at the time, struggling to find a stable job after college. The apartment she shared with her mother had fallen behind on rent, and the landlord, Charles Bennett, had served them with an eviction notice. It had been a shock to Olivia. She'd never imagined it would happen to them. But as she read the fine print of the notice, she realized something. It wasn't legally valid. The landlord had made a mistake, an easily avoidable mistake. And yet, they were still trying to kick her and her mother out. She couldn't accept that. Olivia had gathered every shred of her courage and fought back, spending days reading legal books at the public library. She found the laws that protected tenants like her and used them to challenge the eviction in court. She had represented herself, no lawyer, no legal counsel, and won. It had been the first victory in what would become a long journey. That victory had sparked something in Olivia, a passion for justice that she couldn't ignore. After the case was over, she didn't stop. She kept reading. She kept learning. She kept fighting for other people in the same situation. Olivia found herself attending tenant rights meetings, offering her knowledge to those who didn't know how to fight back. She wasn't a lawyer, but she didn't need to be. She knew the law, and she could use that knowledge to make a difference. It was a dangerous game. She didn't have any official credentials, and most people didn't take her seriously. She didn't have the power or the status of the people she fought against. But that didn't matter to Olivia. She was used to being dismissed. She was used to being overlooked. But she wasn't invisible anymore. And now, here she was, in a courtroom, facing down a powerful landlord and a seasoned judge who had already written her off as nothing more than a minor inconvenience. Olivia wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for everyone who had ever been silenced, for everyone who had ever been ignored by the system. She was no longer the quiet woman in the corner. She was standing up, speaking her truth, and demanding that the system take notice. Her thoughts were interrupted as the door to the courtroom opened and the judge returned, signaling the end of the recess. Olivia stood as he entered, her resolve unwavering. She had already made her case, but this was far from over. This was just the beginning. Judge Callahan took his seat again, his gaze shifting between Olivia and her opponent, Henry Brooks, who was sitting on the opposite side of the room, still looking confident, though now there was an edge of uncertainty in his eyes. "All right, Miss Carter," Judge Callahan said, his voice quieter than before. "You've made your point, and I'll be reviewing the evidence. But I need to ask, why are you doing this? You could have just accepted the eviction. You could have moved on, found another place. You didn't have to fight back like this. So why are you doing it?" Olivia's eyes never left the judge. She knew this question was coming, and she had prepared for it. "Because, Your Honor," she said, her voice steady, "there are people out there who don't have a choice. People who don't know the law, who don't have the time or resources to fight back. I didn't choose to be in this situation, but I'm here now, and I'm not backing down." The judge's eyes narrowed slightly, as though trying to gauge whether she was being entirely honest. But Olivia didn't flinch. She wasn't just defending her home. She was standing up for the people who had no voice, for those who had been crushed under the weight of the system for far too long. Her answer hung in the air, and for a moment, the courtroom was still. The room was still, and all eyes were on Judge Callahan as he carefully examined the documents Olivia had submitted. For the first time since the hearing began, there was a sense of hesitation in the air. The judge, who had ruled on hundreds of cases like this one, clearly didn't know how to proceed. Olivia had thrown him off balance, and that was something he wasn't used to. As Judge Callahan flipped through the stack of papers in front of him, Olivia remained silent. She stood tall, her back straight, her expression calm, but her mind was racing. She had come this far, but she knew the real battle was still ahead. This wasn't just about winning one case. It was about exposing a system that had been rigged for too long, and if she succeeded, it could make a real difference. Judge Callahan's brow furrowed as he scanned Olivia's lease agreement, the documents showing discrepancies in the eviction notice, and the legal precedents she had cited. The case was becoming more complicated by the second, and he could feel the weight of the room's anticipation. He wasn't just looking at a tenant fighting back anymore. He was looking at someone who knew the law as well, if not better, than some of the lawyers in the room. And that wasn't something he had ever encountered before. After a long pause, the judge cleared his throat. He had hoped the case would be a quick one. It had already taken more time than he was comfortable with, and the longer it went on, the more it unsettled him. "I'll admit, Miss Carter," he said, his voice softer than before, "you've presented a well-researched argument, and I'm impressed with the depth of your knowledge." Olivia met his gaze, her expression unwavering. "Thank you, Your Honor." "But," the judge continued, "that still doesn't change the fact that there's a lease agreement at play here. Regardless of any procedural mistakes in the eviction notice, the fundamental issue still stands. Did you violate your lease, Miss Carter? That's what I need to determine." At this, Olivia's eyes narrowed slightly. She had been expecting this. The judge, while clearly unnerved, still clung to the basic assumption that the case was about the lease agreement and nothing more. He hadn't yet realized that what she was doing was about much more than just her own eviction. "I did not violate my lease, Your Honor," Olivia replied, her voice steady. "And that's why this eviction is invalid. The landlord, Mr. Brooks, claims that I failed to pay rent on time, but the truth is, I paid every month. I have the bank statements to prove it." She handed over another stack of papers, her evidence clearly laid out. These were the transaction records, payment history from her bank, along with email exchanges between her and the landlord, all confirming that she had paid the rent in full each month. The judge looked through the papers, his face hardening as he read. Olivia could tell that something had shifted in him. He was no longer just dismissing her. He was listening. "I see," the judge murmured, his voice tight. He didn't look up as he read through the final page of the transaction records. Olivia could see him processing the information, and she could feel the shift in the room. It was subtle, but it was there. "Your Honor, I also want to remind you of an important point," Olivia said, her voice calm but firm. "The landlord cannot serve an eviction notice for a reason that isn't legally valid. The lease does not contain any clause that allows him to evict me for any other reason than non-payment or violation of terms. I have adhered to every clause in that agreement." The judge's eyes narrowed as he turned back to look at her. There was a flicker of something in his gaze now, perhaps a mix of surprise and begrudging respect. "You're not just arguing the technicalities of the law, are you?" Judge Callahan asked, his tone more thoughtful than before. "This goes deeper, doesn't it?" Olivia's heart skipped a beat. She had expected him to catch on, but hearing him say it out loud felt different. For a brief moment, she felt the weight of everything she had been fighting for. The years of studying, the sleepless nights spent researching legal cases, the countless hours spent helping others who didn't have the resources to help themselves. It wasn't just about winning this one case. It was about exposing a system that had been built to protect the powerful while crushing the vulnerable. "Yes, Your Honor," she said, her voice quiet but unwavering. "It goes deeper than just this case. This is about the way tenants like me are treated by landlords who break the law, knowing they'll never face consequences. This is about the corruption that runs through the system, where the rich and powerful can get away with anything, while people like me are left with nothing." The judge stared at her for a long moment. The room had grown eerily quiet, the only sound the faint hum of the ceiling fan overhead. Everyone seemed to be holding their breath, waiting for his next words. "You're asking me to do more than just rule on this eviction case," Judge Callahan said slowly. "You're asking me to expose something much bigger." Olivia nodded, her eyes steady. "Yes, Your Honor. This is bigger than me. This is about all the tenants who have been unfairly evicted, who don't know their rights and are too afraid to speak up. It's about the system that enables it, the system that protects landlords like Mr. Brooks." The judge exhaled sharply, running his hand through his hair again. "I've seen corruption in this system. I've seen it, and I've looked the other way. But if what you're saying is true—" His voice trailed off as he looked over at Mr. Brooks, whose once confident expression was now one of worry. "If what you're saying is true, then this case could be much more than just a simple eviction." The shift in the room was palpable. Olivia could feel the change, the shift from a routine hearing to something much bigger. And for the first time, Judge Callahan seemed to understand the full extent of what was at stake. "Mr. Brooks," the judge said, his voice suddenly sharp, "you are hereby ordered to provide all relevant documents regarding this eviction. If any of them are found to be falsified or improperly filed, this case will be dismissed, and further legal action will be taken." A tense silence filled the room. Olivia's heart was racing, but she didn't let it show. She had done it. She had gotten the judge to acknowledge the corruption, to see beyond the simple eviction notice and into the larger issue of landlord abuse. For a moment, everything seemed still. Then, with a quick motion, Olivia reached into her bag and pulled out a final piece of evidence. "Your Honor," she said quietly, "there's one more thing. I've compiled a list of other tenants who have been evicted by Mr. Brooks under similar circumstances. I believe they deserve to be heard as well." She slid the final stack of papers across the table, and the courtroom fell into a stunned silence once more. The case had taken a dramatic turn, and it wasn't over yet. The weight of Olivia's final statement hung in the air, and the courtroom felt eerily still. Even Henry Brooks, the landlord, seemed to realize that things were no longer going in his favor. His usual smugness had faded, replaced with a tense expression. Olivia had just exposed something he had hoped to keep hidden. But what she had just begun to uncover was far larger than a simple case of wrongful eviction. Judge Callahan, after a long pause, finally stood from his bench, adjusting his glasses and casting one last glance at Olivia. His voice was low, tinged with a mix of exhaustion and concern. "Miss Carter," he began, his eyes meeting hers with a weight of new respect, "I'll have to suspend this case for further investigation. The documents you've provided require scrutiny. But I believe you've opened up something much bigger here, and I can't ignore it." Olivia's heart was pounding, but she kept her expression calm. It was as though everything had led up to this moment. The quiet years of studying the law, the countless hours spent compiling evidence, all of it culminating in this courtroom battle. But the feeling wasn't one of triumph. It was something much deeper, a sense of responsibility, of knowing that what she had uncovered was bigger than her personal case. Judge Callahan looked over at Jonathan Pierce, the lawyer for Mr. Brooks, who was now clearly rattled. Pierce was flipping through the documents Olivia had presented, his expression growing darker as he scanned the pages. "This isn't just a matter of one tenant and one landlord anymore, is it?" Judge Callahan added, more to himself than to anyone in particular. "I need to get the proper authorities involved immediately." A low murmur rippled through the courtroom, but no one dared to speak. The judge's words had created a sense of quiet chaos, a sense that something much larger was unfolding. Olivia had known that this wasn't just about her eviction. She had seen it in the small, quiet injustices that plagued her life for years. She had felt the sting of systemic failures every time a tenant was evicted unfairly. But now, she was beginning to see the true scope of the issue. And that was when it hit her. The system wasn't just corrupt at the level of a landlord and a tenant. It went deeper than that. It wasn't just a matter of bad landlords taking advantage of their tenants. It was a network, an entire infrastructure of powerful people in government, law enforcement, and the legal system who protected them. Henry Brooks wasn't acting alone. Neither was Pierce. The corruption ran deeper, into the very institutions meant to safeguard people like her. It was like a puzzle that Olivia had begun to piece together. And now, she was standing on the precipice of something much more dangerous than she had ever anticipated. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps approaching. A figure entered the courtroom, a man in a sharp black suit, with a calm yet confident demeanor. He was tall, his gaze steady as he walked toward the judge's bench. It was David Callaway, a lawyer Olivia had never met before, but one who seemed to carry an aura of power with him. His presence shifted the room once more. "Your Honor," David said, his voice smooth. "I'm David Callaway, and I represent a client who believes Miss Carter's case may be of more significance than even she realizes." Olivia raised an eyebrow, intrigued. The courtroom was silent, everyone waiting for David to elaborate. She had no idea who he was or why he was stepping into her case, but there was something about the way he spoke that commanded attention. "Miss Carter," David continued, turning toward her, "I've been following your case from the sidelines, and I believe you're onto something much larger. The eviction practices you've uncovered, illegal notices, falsified documents, manipulation of legal procedures, they are all part of a larger scheme, one that involves a network of powerful individuals who are profiting off these illegal activities. And I think you may be unknowingly in the crosshairs of something much more dangerous than you realize." Olivia's pulse quickened. This was what she had suspected all along. What started as an attempt to save her home had snowballed into something bigger. Much bigger. The room fell silent as David spoke. His words confirmed what Olivia had feared. This wasn't just about exposing one bad landlord. It was about confronting a massive network that stretched far beyond the courtroom. "Mr. Callaway," Judge Callahan asked, his voice now filled with caution, "what exactly are you suggesting?" David turned his gaze back to the judge. "I'm suggesting that Miss Carter is not just a victim of a simple landlord-tenant dispute. She's stumbled upon a much larger operation, an operation that involves several corrupt individuals who are using their power in the legal system to manipulate eviction proceedings for financial gain. The evidence she's uncovered could be the key to exposing this entire network." Olivia's mind raced. She had been focused on her own eviction, but now she realized she had uncovered a web of deceit that reached much further than she could have imagined. There were people involved in this who had the power to bury her, to erase all traces of the truth. David turned his attention back to Olivia, his voice soft but urgent. "You've done something that few people have been brave enough to do, Miss Carter. But now, you need to understand that exposing this isn't just going to affect you. It's going to put you directly in the crosshairs of some very powerful people. The landlord and his lawyer are just pawns in a much larger game. This is bigger than just one case. It's about corruption on a scale that involves politicians, judges, and others in positions of authority." A chill ran down Olivia's spine. She wasn't just fighting for her home anymore. She was about to take on a system, one that had been rigged for so long that it seemed impossible to dismantle. But the stakes were too high now. She couldn't stop. "The people behind this," David continued, "they won't hesitate to destroy anyone who stands in their way. And that includes you." The tension in the room was suffocating. Olivia's mind raced, trying to absorb the enormity of what she had just learned. This wasn't just about her eviction case. It was about something much more dangerous. The power that she had thought was just confined to landlords now extended to the very institutions that were supposed to protect her. But despite the fear creeping into her chest, Olivia knew one thing for certain. She wasn't going to back down. She couldn't. Not when so many people had already been hurt by this system. David's voice cut through her thoughts again. "You've made an enemy of the wrong people, Miss Carter. But I believe you've also made an ally in me." Olivia glanced at him, still trying to process everything he was saying. She wasn't sure she trusted him yet, but she knew one thing. She had come this far, and she couldn't turn back now. Whatever this network was, whatever dangers lay ahead, she would face them head-on. "Your Honor," David said, turning his attention back to Judge Callahan, "I suggest that Miss Carter's case be handed over to the authorities immediately. This is a matter for law enforcement, not just a courtroom." Judge Callahan, who had remained silent until now, nodded slowly. "I agree," he said reluctantly. "This is no longer just a tenant dispute. I'll contact the appropriate authorities and ensure that an investigation is launched." Olivia exhaled slowly, the weight of everything pressing down on her. She had started this fight to save her home, but now she was about to take on something much larger, a fight that could cost her everything. As the courtroom emptied for the day, Olivia stood alone in the center of the room, the enormity of what lay ahead settling over her. This wasn't just about winning her case anymore. This was about changing everything, and she wasn't afraid. The following days passed in a blur for Olivia Carter. The courtroom had been buzzing with the news of her case, her bold challenge against Henry Brooks and the legal establishment. The media picked up on it quickly, drawn to the quiet woman who had taken on a powerful landlord and turned the tables in an instant. While most people still couldn't quite understand how she had pulled it off, there was one thing they all agreed on. Olivia Carter was not a woman to be underestimated. As for Olivia herself, the reality of her situation was beginning to settle in. She had taken the first step, exposing the deep-rooted corruption in the system. But now, she faced a much bigger challenge. This was no longer just about her home or her eviction. It was about taking on a system that had been rigged for years, a system that had protected the powerful, who had exploited those like her. And it wasn't just the landlords. There were judges, lawyers, politicians, and others who were complicit in this mess. They were the ones who needed to be held accountable. But Olivia wasn't in this fight alone anymore. After the hearing, Olivia had found herself sitting across from David Callaway in a quiet cafe, his eyes studying her carefully as he sipped his coffee. David was an attorney who specialized in high-stakes cases that involved deep corruption, where the law was manipulated by those with the means to do so. He had made his interest in her case clear, but she was still cautious. "Miss Carter," David began, setting his coffee cup down with a soft clink. "I've been watching your case, and I've got to say, you've done more than most lawyers would have. But what you're up against now isn't just one bad landlord. It's an entire network, one that's been in place for decades." Olivia looked at him, a bit wary. She wasn't sure if she could trust him completely yet, but there was something about the way he spoke that made her feel like he was genuinely trying to help. He wasn't just offering her help to win a case. He was offering her a way to fight back against the corruption that had haunted her, and so many others, for years. "And I want to help you," David continued, his voice steady and confident. "I've worked with a lot of people who've tried to take down corrupt systems like this one, and I've seen the toll it takes. but I've also seen the power that knowledge can have. What you're doing isn't just brave, it's necessary. And I believe you can do more than just take down Henry Brooks. You can bring this entire operation down." Olivia's heart raced at his words. She had always known that what she was fighting for was bigger than herself, but hearing him say it out loud made it all feel real. The scale of what she had uncovered was massive. She wasn't just fighting for one case anymore, she was fighting to expose an entire system. But as the weight of it all settled over her, so did the fear. What had started as a personal battle was now something much larger, something that could change her life in ways she couldn't yet fully comprehend. David noticed the hesitation in her eyes. "I understand if you're scared. Hell, I'd be scared too," he said, leaning forward. "But the thing is, Olivia, you've already made it this far, and you've done it with nothing but your own knowledge and determination. Imagine what we could do if you had the resources to back you up." Olivia glanced down at the table, her mind racing. She didn't want to admit it, but she knew he was right. She had gotten this far alone, but she couldn't take on the entire network of corruption by herself. She needed help. "Why are you offering this?" Olivia asked, looking up at him. "What do you get out of it?" David didn't look away. "I've spent my career helping people who are fighting against powerful systems. People like you. People who are trying to do the right thing, but who don't have the resources to back them up. I run a law firm that specializes in high-stakes cases, and we've taken on corruption in government, big business, and the legal system. But we need people like you, people with the passion and the will to see things through. People who are willing to fight for what's right, no matter the cost." Olivia absorbed his words, the weight of his offer sinking in. She wasn't sure if she could trust him completely, but there was something about David that made her believe he was sincere. He wasn't offering her a way out. He was offering her a way to take this fight to the next level. "Why me?" Olivia asked, her voice softer now. "Why do you think I can do this?" David smiled, but there was no arrogance in it. It was the kind of smile that came from someone who had seen something others hadn't. "Because, Olivia, you've already done the impossible. You've outmaneuvered a landlord, a lawyer, and a judge, all without a law degree, without a legal team. And you've done it with nothing but your own intellect and determination. I've been doing this for years, and I can't tell you how many people have tried to fight corruption and failed. But you're different. You've got what it takes." Olivia's mind was racing. She hadn't expected this kind of offer, and she wasn't sure if she was ready for it. But there was something in David's words that resonated with her. She had spent years quietly fighting for tenants like her, for people who didn't have the means to fight back. She had faced rejection from the system, from the legal world, but she hadn't given up. And now, David was offering her the opportunity to take that fight to the next level. "I'll need some time to think about it," Olivia said quietly. David nodded, as if he had expected nothing less. "Take all the time you need, but know that this is your chance to make a real difference. With the right resources, we can expose everything. We can bring down the entire operation." Olivia stood up from the table, her thoughts still swirling. She wasn't sure what the future held, but she knew that she couldn't walk away from this. Not now. She had come too far, and there was too much at stake. "Thank you," she said, meeting his gaze. "I'll let you know." David smiled. "I'll be here when you're ready, Olivia. And remember, this fight isn't just about you. It's about everyone who has ever been silenced by a corrupt system." Olivia nodded, her heart beating faster as she left the cafe. She had no idea what the future held, but one thing was certain. She wasn't fighting alone anymore. After the meeting with David Callaway, Olivia found herself in an unfamiliar space, one where the stakes had been raised, and the danger she had only suspected now felt all too real. She had barely slept in the days that followed, her mind constantly circling around the enormity of what she was up against. The case had started as a simple eviction, a way to protect her home, but now it was part of something far greater. An attempt to bring down a deeply embedded network of corruption, one that reached into politics, law enforcement, and the highest levels of the judicial system. She hadn't yet agreed to David's offer, but she knew in her heart that she couldn't back down. The fight she had started was bigger than her, and it was only going to get more dangerous from here. She had already made enemies, powerful enemies, and now those enemies were watching her every move. 2 days after her conversation with David, Olivia received an unexpected call. It was early in the morning, and she had just finished making herself a cup of coffee when the phone rang. The number was unfamiliar, but something about the urgency in the voice on the other end immediately put her on edge. "Miss Carter," the voice said, low and clipped, "there's a situation. You need to listen carefully." Olivia's grip tightened around the phone. "Who is this?" she asked, her heart already pounding. "I'm with the FBI," the voice said. "We need to move you. Now." The blood drained from Olivia's face. The FBI? What was going on? "Move me? What are you talking about?" Olivia's voice was shaky now. "There's a target on your back, Miss Carter. We've received intel that you've attracted the attention of some very dangerous people. People who don't like the fact that you've started poking around in their business. We need to get you somewhere safe, immediately." Olivia didn't respond right away. The words barely registered. She had always known that her fight against corruption would be risky, but she hadn't realized the extent of the danger until now. "Is this about the case?" she asked finally, her voice tight with fear. "Yes," the voice confirmed. "You've uncovered something big, bigger than we thought, and the people behind this won't hesitate to take action. You've become a target. We're sending someone to your location right now." Olivia's mind raced. She had been warned. David Callaway had told her that she was in danger, but this was real. It was happening. Her name was already known to people who were willing to do whatever it took to keep their secrets hidden. "I'm not going anywhere," Olivia said, her voice more defiant than she felt. "I can handle this." The agent on the other end sighed. "I understand your reluctance, but this is not a choice. These people will stop at nothing. You need protection. We're sending someone to meet you now. Trust me, Miss Carter. You don't want to ignore this." Before she could respond, the line went dead. Olivia stood there for a moment, the phone pressed against her ear, her mind in a haze. The magnitude of the situation had just hit her like a punch to the gut. She wasn't just fighting for her home anymore. She was fighting for her life. She grabbed her bag and hurried to her apartment's small kitchen table. Her fingers shook as she flipped through the papers she had gathered for her case, the weight of it all sinking in. She had known that exposing the corruption would have consequences, but she hadn't expected it to come so quickly. Now she was in danger, serious danger, and she couldn't afford to ignore it. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was a text message from David. "I've spoken to the FBI. They're aware of your situation. You need to trust them, Olivia. Don't take any chances. If you're still not sure, we'll talk more later. But we're running out of time." Olivia read the message twice. Her heart pounded in her chest, but the reality of the situation settled over her like a heavy weight. There was no going back now. She knew she had no choice. The people she was up against weren't just going to walk away. They were ruthless, and they had the power to make her disappear without a second thought. But Olivia had a bigger mission now. She couldn't stop. As she grabbed her coat and headed for the door, the sound of a car engine revving outside caught her attention. She glanced through the window and saw a black SUV parked at the curb. Two men were standing near the vehicle, scanning the street. One of them was looking directly at her window. Without thinking, she stepped back from the window and turned to grab her things. There was no time to waste. The FBI had been right. Things were escalating quickly. She couldn't risk staying in her apartment any longer. Olivia hurried out the door, glancing quickly at the men standing outside. They didn't move, and that unsettled her. Had they been watching her? Had they known she would make a run for it? Just as she stepped into the hallway of the building, the door to her apartment flew open. A man in a suit stepped inside, his face stern and serious. "Olivia Carter?" the man asked, his voice firm. Olivia froze for a moment, unsure of who he was. But when he showed her his badge, a cold shiver ran down her spine. "FBI," he said. "You need to come with me, now." Without hesitation, Olivia followed him down the stairs and out the back exit of the building. She glanced nervously over her shoulder, but the men in the SUV had already driven off. The agent led her to an unmarked car parked down the street, his hand resting on his gun holster. As she slid into the back seat, the agent turned to her. "We need to get you out of here. Now." Olivia's pulse was racing, her breath coming faster. She had no idea where they were taking her, but she knew one thing for certain. Things were only going to get worse from here. The fight she had started had opened a door to a world of danger, one that she was now fully entrenched in. There was no turning back. As the car sped away from her apartment, Olivia looked out the window. She couldn't help but feel a sense of finality. She had taken the first steps to expose a corrupt system, but now she was in the fight of her life. And if she was going to survive it, she would need to rely on everything she had learned, and everyone who had decided to stand with her. The car ride was a blur. Olivia sat in the back of the FBI vehicle, her eyes wide, her mind racing. She had expected her battle to be one fought in a courtroom, using her knowledge of the law to expose corruption. What she hadn't expected was to be caught in a dangerous game where powerful people with far-reaching influence were willing to do anything to protect their secrets. The agent, who had introduced himself as Agent Carter, was focused on the road, his eyes darting between the street and the rearview mirror as if expecting to be followed. Olivia had only met him briefly, but there was no mistaking the seriousness in his demeanor. He wasn't just a law enforcement officer. He was part of something much bigger, a network that worked to uncover the very corruption Olivia had stumbled upon. "Where are we going?" Olivia finally asked, breaking the tense silence in the car. Her voice was steady, but beneath it, she could feel the undercurrent of fear. Agent Carter glanced at her in the rearview mirror, his face unreadable. "We're taking you to a safe house," he replied, his voice flat. "It's better if we don't disclose the location right now. We need to keep you off the radar." Olivia nodded, trying to make sense of what was happening. She had been thrust into a world she didn't fully understand, and now she was being forced into hiding. The thought of leaving everything behind, the case, the fight, the people she was trying to protect, it made her heart ache. But she knew that for now, survival had to come first. She turned to look out the window, her mind flashing back to the moment when she had first realized how deep the corruption ran. It wasn't just Henry Brooks, the landlord who had tried to evict her. It was a network of people, each more powerful and dangerous than the last. They had money. They had influence. And most importantly, they had the ability to make people disappear. She thought back to the brief conversation with David Callaway, the lawyer who had stepped into her case. He had been the first to tell her that the eviction case was just the tip of the iceberg. He had warned her that what she was up against wasn't just one corrupt landlord, but a far-reaching system that exploited vulnerable people at every turn. Her heart pounded as she remembered his words. "You've made an enemy of the wrong people." And now, she was living that reality. Hours later, the car finally stopped. The driver's side door opened, and Agent Carter stepped out, signaling for Olivia to follow. She hesitated, her heart racing as she glanced around. The neighborhood looked ordinary, quiet, suburban even, but she knew better than to trust appearances. They entered an unmarked building, one that appeared to be an ordinary office complex from the outside. Inside, it was sterile and minimalist. Olivia was led through a series of hallways before being ushered into a small, windowless room. A single bed, a desk, and a chair were the only furniture. "This will be your home for the time being," Agent Carter said as he set a bag of supplies on the desk. "We'll keep a low profile here. No phones, no internet. You're off the grid until we figure out our next steps." Olivia's stomach churned. She had fought so hard to get to this point, to make a difference, and now she was being forced into hiding like a criminal. She had always hated feeling powerless, and this situation only made it worse. "Do you have any idea what's going on?" she asked, her voice shaking. Agent Carter paused, looking at her with a hard, unreadable expression. "What I can tell you is that you've exposed a massive operation, and there are people who will do anything to stop you from bringing it down. We're doing everything we can to protect you, but you need to stay quiet. Stay out of sight." Olivia's eyes narrowed. "And then what? I hide here for the rest of my life?" "No," Agent Carter said, his voice cold but firm. "We're not giving up. We're going after them. We've already started the investigation, but it's bigger than we thought. This network goes all the way to the top. We need to gather more evidence, and we need your help." Olivia clenched her fists. She had spent too long studying the law, helping others, to simply disappear. "I'm not going to hide. I won't stop until I've exposed everyone involved. I'm not afraid of them." Carter's eyes softened slightly, but his voice remained firm. "You don't have to be afraid, but you need to be smart. You can't take on this fight alone anymore. Not when the people we're up against have the resources to make you disappear." Olivia stood tall, meeting his gaze. She was scared, but the fire inside her had only grown stronger. "I didn't start this fight to hide, and I'm not stopping now." The next few weeks were a blur of secrecy and constant caution. Olivia stayed in the safe house, her every movement monitored by the FBI. She was kept isolated, cut off from the world she once knew. But every day, she worked in the shadows, helping Agent Carter and his team uncover the depth of the corruption she had exposed. They pieced together documents, tracked financial records, and followed leads that pointed to one undeniable truth. The people behind the illegal eviction practices were not just corrupt. They were untouchable. But Olivia wasn't backing down. With each passing day, she grew more determined. She knew that she couldn't fight this war alone. She had already made her case public, and her name had gained traction. The media had started to take notice, and despite the dangers, Olivia knew she had a platform now, a chance to make a real difference. And then, one evening, as she sat in the dimly lit room, a text message flashed on her burner phone. It was from David. "I have a lead. It's time to make our move. Are you ready?" Her heart skipped a beat. She knew that this was it. The moment when everything changed. The FBI, despite all their resources, hadn't been able to break through the layers of corruption that surrounded the people involved. But with David's help, maybe they could. Olivia stood up, her mind made up. She wasn't going to hide anymore. She had exposed the first layer of this massive web of corruption, and now she was going to take the next step. If she was going to bring this down, she couldn't do it in the shadows. The air in the safe house felt suffocating, thick with anticipation. Olivia had barely slept in days, her mind preoccupied with what lay ahead. David's message had come through like a shot of adrenaline. "I have a lead. It's time to make our move. Are you ready?" Her pulse quickened just thinking about it. She wasn't just ready. She was desperate. Desperate to finish what she had started. Desperate to expose everything. She packed her things quickly, her hands steady despite the chaos of her thoughts. The safe house had been her sanctuary. But now, it felt like a prison. A temporary shelter while the real fight happened outside. The walls had begun to close in on her. She had spent weeks hiding, gathering evidence, but she could no longer remain in the shadows. This wasn't about survival anymore. It was about taking down the people who had destroyed countless lives, including her own. David's plan was risky, but Olivia knew there was no other option. The FBI had done what they could, but it was time to take matters into her own hands. The network of corruption that had been operating in the shadows for so long wouldn't be brought down through quiet investigations and sealed-off rooms. It was going to take something bigger, something that would shake the system to its core. The night she received David's message, the walls of the safe house began to close in on her. It felt like the calm before the storm, the stillness before everything would change. The decision had been made. Olivia wouldn't be a passive participant in this fight anymore. It was time for the world to see what she had uncovered, to hear the truth, the whole truth. Olivia knew the risks. David had made sure she understood the danger. These people wouldn't hesitate to do whatever it took to shut her down. But her fight wasn't just her own anymore. She had spoken up for others, fought for the voiceless, and now she had become the voice of the forgotten. The system that had failed so many was about to be exposed, and Olivia was the one who would pull back the curtain. The next morning, the sun barely peeking over the horizon, Olivia slipped out of the safe house unnoticed. Agent Carter had left earlier, and she took the opportunity to make her move. She had no intention of disappearing again. She was ready for whatever came next, even if it meant facing the powerful forces that had already tried to silence her. Her phone buzzed again. This time, a call from David. "Olivia," his voice came through the line, smooth but with an edge of urgency. "We've got one shot at this. We're going public. We can't hold back any longer. I need you to meet me at the courthouse. It's time." Her heart pounded in her chest. The courthouse. It was where it all began. But this time, it was going to be different. It wasn't just her eviction anymore. It wasn't just one case. This was her chance to bring down the entire network of corruption, to expose the powerful people who had controlled the system for far too long. "I'm on my way," Olivia replied, her voice calm but determined. As Olivia arrived at the courthouse, she couldn't help but feel a surge of adrenaline. She had stood here before, nervous and uncertain. But today was different. She was ready. Her footsteps echoed in the empty hallway as she made her way to the courtroom, where David, along with a small group of activists, tenants, and reporters, waited. The media had already begun to gather outside, their cameras flashing as they prepared to capture the event. The air was thick with anticipation. David was waiting for her, his expression serious but determined. He didn't waste any time. "We don't have much time," he said, his voice low. "Once we get this out, there's no turning back. Are you ready?" Olivia nodded, her jaw set. "I've been ready for this for a long time," David gave her a small nod of approval before turning to the group gathered in the room. "This is it," he said. "Today, we're going to expose the truth. The world is going to know what's been going on behind the scenes. We've got the evidence. We've got the power. It's time to bring these people down." As they made their way into the courtroom, Olivia took a deep breath. She could feel the eyes of the world on her. This wasn't just about legal documents anymore. This wasn't just about fighting for one eviction case. This was a battle for justice, a fight to take down the people who had controlled the system for too long. David opened the door to the courtroom, and Olivia stepped inside, her heart pounding in her chest. The media swarmed in, their cameras trained on her, capturing every moment. The sound of murmurs and camera flashes filled the room. Then, Olivia took her place at the podium, facing the sea of reporters, activists, and the few remaining supporters. She held up the evidence, the documents, the records, the proof of a system rigged to benefit the powerful and crush the vulnerable. She didn't speak right away. She let the weight of the evidence settle in. "My name is Olivia Carter," she began, her voice steady, clear, and unwavering. "I'm not a lawyer. I don't have a law degree. But I've spent the last year studying the law because I had no choice. When I was faced with eviction, I did what thousands of people are forced to do every day. I fought back. But what I found was worse than I could have imagined." She paused, allowing the silence to settle in the room. The cameras clicked, the world waiting for her next words. "The system isn't broken," Olivia continued, her voice growing stronger. "It's working exactly as it was designed to work, to protect the powerful and silence the people who need it the most. What I've uncovered isn't just one bad landlord. It's a network of corruption that has infiltrated every level of our legal system, our government, and our society. And it's time to bring it down." The room erupted into chaos. Reporters scrambled to ask questions, their microphones pushed toward her. Activists and supporters cheered, their voices lifting in unison with Olivia's call for justice. Olivia's heart raced. She had done it. She had made her stand. And now, there was no going back. The fight was on. The battle to expose the system and dismantle the corruption that had ruled for so long was just beginning. Hours later, Olivia sat in a back office with David, watching the news unfold. The documents she had provided, the records that proved the widespread corruption, were all over the media. The story was out there, and there was no going back now. But as the day wore on, Olivia couldn't shake the feeling that the fight was only just beginning. As powerful as the people she had exposed were, they weren't going to let this go without a fight. There would be retaliation. There would always be retaliation. But Olivia knew one thing for sure. She wasn't backing down. The doors of the office opened, and David walked in, a smile on his face. "It's done," he said. "The world knows now." Olivia stood up, her gaze unwavering. "It's not done. Not until they're held accountable." David smiled back, his eyes glinting with approval. "Then let's make sure they are." As they left the office, Olivia felt a sense of purpose she had never felt before. The battle she had started was just beginning, but for the first time, she knew she was not alone. She had allies now, real ones, people who were willing to stand by her side. And together, they would bring down the system.